Good morning and welcome to the TC Dojo from Single Sourcing Solutions. The TC Dojo is a TechCon community that is driven by you. Tell us what you want to learn. You choose the topics and we find the experts. In the TC Dojo open session today, we have Melissa Schuck. Melissa has spent over a decade in various communication positions, including 6 years supporting the military on technical writing innovation, public affairs. She's lent her communications talent to engineering, manufacturing, research organizations, and spent 4 years focused on shaping the future of these fields by teaching higher education courses in general writing and editing, in communications theory, technical and business communication, public relations, and social and new media. And I'm thrilled she's here to share her work with us in the TC Dojo today.
Thank you so much for having me. I am really excited to continue this conversation. So this presentation really started many years ago when I was working towards my master's degree in technical communication. And I was working with the military and I was having a lot of issues editing, writing, figuring out problem solving with this community. And I couldn't really find good research to help me guide my decision making. So that is where this presentation was really born. Deconflict, a user-centered approach to editing for the military. So a bit about my story. You just heard a little bit about my background, but I have worked with the military, specifically at MacDill Air Force Base for many years. And this is where some problems started. I went into some projects and some contracts as a technical writer and a technical editor. But one of the first things I realized is that a lot of documentation really isn't standardized. Or if it is, it has a standard that no one really understands, or a standard that doesn't really work, or it's using language that not everyone can understand. Now, I work specifically with US Special Operations Command and US Central Command, which are both joint headquarters. So if we look at a quick DoD framework, if you're not totally familiar with how the framework works, it starts up at top with the president. You have the Secretary of Defense. Then we go down into the different military secretaries, the offices of the Secretary of Defense, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Down there on the green side is where we see our military service specific. So this is Air Force specific, Army specific, Navy specific services. So you will have your Air Force service headquarters, you'll have your major Air Force commands, you'll have your Air Force components, and your Air Force as a whole. Now, this is a really high level look at what these policies actually look like and where they come from. But as you can kind of start to understand, if we have one of each of these for each of our military services, and within each of our military services, our policy framework is broken down into many different sections, we start to see a lot of complexity come up. And then when we look on the right side, the purple boxes, we see from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, we have joint staff. And what this means is we have groups of people from all the different services coming together, usually to work on a specific region or a specific concept. So you might have something like US Central Command, where you will have entities from each of our services working together in the central region, which is generally the Middle East. So we can consider that joint policy as a lot of different people from the different services coming together. But when we look at the green side, we see that each of the services create their own policy, their own framework, their own standards. And then they come together on the purple side, each having different understandings of what makes good policy, what makes good documents, what makes good standards. So my issues working in a joint command was looking at people from all the different services who couldn't come together and agree how a single document should be written. So that's where some of our problems start, is we have this complex framework of a lot of different people with a lot of different backgrounds coming together, having to make the same decisions. So how do we start to kind of think about the problems that come about? So a lot of these problems are pretty standard, but it really helps to start by thinking of the military as a discourse community. So specifically, a discourse community is a group of people sharing similar goals for communicating. So within the Air Force, we have the Air Force as a group of people sharing a similar goal, serving in the Air Force. That's one discourse community. The Navy as a discourse community. The Army as a discourse community. But then we can also see how those communities are broken down even further. We have people at specific bases who develop a discourse community because they develop a specific way of communicating just at that base, or just in that division, or just in that department. They start to develop specific ways for communicating. So if we look at the military as a whole, as a giant discourse community, but also understand that we're breaking that down into many subcommunities. And now, one of the issues that we see a lot when we have to make decisions with military clients and documentation for the military is those joint spaces. If you go on just a Navy contract and you're working in a single Navy division, you're likely to have to learn their standards, learn what their style is, and if they have a style guide. You're likely to also have to do some problem solving. But this gets really complicated in those joint spaces where we have people from all of the different services coming together to communicate together. So that becomes really complicated because now we have 4 or more people with all these different standards, backgrounds, and they think theirs is the only right answer. So part of understanding this discourse community is understanding the development of language. So something that's important is that while we might just see the end result, we might just see one person who is really adamant about how a document should be designed. Our perspective for actually getting through that issue is to look way back to the beginning of that person's service and understand where their perception came from. Understand how language morphs through their service. So it starts all the way back in basic training. Right when they join up, the first thing they do is they go to basic training and they learn basic communication standards. So they're already starting to learn these standards in the very, very beginning of their service. As they move through the different parts of their service, maybe they go to a technical school, they have different trainings, they might go on to get a degree. Depending on what they do, what their course is, they're going to go to different places and learn additional standards that are going to shape their language and that are going to shape the perception of what they believe proper communications is. This can also happen in chance situations, especially those that need abbreviated communications. If we're talking about service members that are overseas, especially service members that are in areas of conflict, there really is a need for abbreviated communication. So we see that they use this abbreviated communication out of a need to use it. And then it becomes part of their lexicon, it becomes part of their language, and it becomes part of what they see as correct. So it's important that we understand that that is developed through their culture. Through that military culture, they become connected to these parts of their language. So new terms can come up to bond personnel. They can create cohesion. So again, we go back to that discourse community. They can group people together. It can also, again, accelerate communications or explain vague or hard to define concepts. So that last one is something that can come up, especially in military service, because sometimes you're working in situations that are constantly changing. And when something's constantly changing, you might not have the language you need to explain what that change is or what the result is. So we might create new language as well. So looking at the military as a discourse community, their language, what they say, how they say it, how they organize, what they believe their standards are, isn't just something that was created one day. It's something that's been cultivated over time that's connected to the culture of these individuals. So like we saw in that first diagram, military best practices are developed through highly regulated procedures. So it's not just one person saying, oh, this is what's best. Very often, future policy will build from previous policy. So they'll be looking at what was published previously and build off of that, very often taking bits and pieces and parts from previous policy to integrate into future policy or future documentation. And there's almost always an extensive vetting process. So you might have to go up multiple levels for approval on documents. If it's a big overarching joint policy that you're making edits to, it could be very extensive. You might have 10, 20 or more people who have to really oversee, check off on, or even sign off on a policy or procedure. So it's extensive. And it does, as I've looked at this, become a blend of academic, private sector, military specific, and subcommunity unique best practices. So we don't really have a single factor here that's influencing military communications. Some of it comes straight out of academia. Some of it we see really common in the private sector. Some of it we see really common in all military circles. So going back to basic training and the basic foundations of what the military believes is effective communication. And then other components are specific to the subcommunity. So specific to the division, department, or group of people that is the one step removed from the document or the communication. So we have a lot of different factors coming together here. And again, it's helpful to look back at the history and understand the development, and also understand how that development is also linked to the culture of the military and the culture of the group you're working with. So one of our problems, one of our points of friction I very often see is when multiple documents cover similar topics. So again, we said there's a lot of different groups. So we have the services broken out into their own groups that are broken out into subgroups and subgroups and subgroups. We have joint communities, which are representatives of the different services coming together to solve a specific issue, work in a specific region. They also have subgroups, subgroups, subgroups. So when we have all of these different groups across the board, sometimes what happens is either someone believes that a document isn't sufficient, so they make their own. Someone doesn't know that other documentation exists, so they create their own. Or they just want to make a specific component, almost like the addendum, to a bigger document. So we start to see multiple documents covering similar topics. So for example, we might have a joint doctrine, like a DoD Joint Publication, so coming from the very top, and then a service doctrine, so a Navy doctrine, might give more specific details, more specific guidance on that DoD Joint Publication. And then you might go even further down into Navy subgroups. A specific division might publish a policy or a document that tells that division how they're enacting that DoD Joint Publication, Navy doctrine, and all the way down to the end. So you might have multiple documents. So if someone is aware of the joint publication, but they're not aware of the Navy publication, that can cause friction. If someone is aware of a lower level document, but they don't understand how it fits into the whole scheme of the other documentation, that can be an issue. But very often what I see in joint communities is that there's conflict when we're choosing the standard. So if someone in the Army is following the Army's doctrine on a specific DoD joint publication, they might be in conflict with someone from the Navy who's following the Navy's guidance on a DoD joint publication. So we have to kind of see how these parts come together to really lead us to our point where we're sitting at our desk trying to develop a document, and we have multiple people who are either co-authoring with us, or they're giving us review or approval, or they're giving us content for the document, and how we can fit all these pieces together. So some of the issues, very specifically, that we see in military environments persist because they're in previous documentation. So I said that we look backwards and we say, okay, a previous publication was published, we'll start there, take out of that what we need, and then add new, or change to make it updated, or be more specific about how we're going to do this in our department. And writing mechanics issues very often get pushed forward because it's in the previous document. So there is a little bit of an assumption as what was published previously is correct, and so I'm going to keep pushing that forward. So we'll see a lot of writing mechanics issues, issues with comma placement, little things like that in documentation, because they just keep getting pushed forward and no one wants to say, I don't think that's really correct there. Now, these little issues are usually not connected to culture. So things like comma placement is often not connected to culture. So where do we put this period? Should we break this long sentence into a smaller sentence? Minor discussions of writing mechanics are often not connected to culture. These are often a really good place for us to start to talk about improving our communications in an objective way. So especially aligning with outside standards, aligning with outside style guides that might be related to the field that the group is working in, or even just outside standard English, especially when we talk about punctuation. But we do have to distinguish the issues that are not connected to culture, that are connected to culture. So again, language is very often culturally connected. And an example I use of this is the word deconflict. So the word deconflict, the technical definition, is to change the flight path of an airborne object to avoid collision. So if two planes are flying towards each other, you're going to deconflict that issue by changing the flight path of one of those planes or both of those planes. So our technical definition of deconflict really is all about navigating airspace. It's all about changing flight paths. So it's a very technical concept. But this word has evolved in military circles to become more than that technical definition. The evolved definition is to find a resolution for any competing concepts or actions. So for example, project managers need to deconflict priorities among concurrent projects. So in this second definition, it has nothing to do with airborne objects, but the community itself has changed the definition. Now, this definition isn't accepted in any policy that I could personally find as an official definition, but the evolved definition is very important to understand for communications. So especially if you're working with someone in the Air Force, they might be very comfortable with using the word deconflict as a way of describing how to change around competing priorities. I've seen this more in outside the Air Force as well, getting into other groups and other services, this definition of deconflict. I've talked with people that are outside of my personal circles in the military who have also heard this word over and over again with this evolved definition. So it's definitely becoming a very common term. And if you're working maybe on an Air Force base or in a joint environment that has a lot of Air Force personnel in it, you might hear them use this word a lot. And it's something that's very important because it is culturally connected. And if you try to challenge that use of deconflict and change it out to be another term, something that's more generic, more vague, it might cause some friction because they feel like, again, you're removing part of the identity, that military culture from their communication. And we're almost inherently saying that their language that they use, that they've learned throughout their military service, is wrong. And so we can start to see how it might be a problem to tell someone that their culturally connected language is wrong. So what do we do? So now we're in a bit of a rock and a hard place situation because we see that there might be an issue. We see something we might want to change, but we don't want to tell someone that their culturally connected language is wrong. So 3 recommendations that I've used that have worked to really help people move through these communications issues is first to determine if language is linked to culture. And if it is, we want to standardize culturally significant language. So we don't want to say we're going to get rid of all this stuff because it's not part of standard English. We want to say if this is the language that's important to this community, we want to standardize it. We want to give it a definition and we want to use it in the proper way every time. So understanding that we're going to not get rid of culturally connected languages, We're going to properly incorporate it so it's standardized. We want to use ethnographic study. So we're stealing a bit from anthropologists here, but really looking at our community and identifying language that's repeated in formal and informal settings. If you hear a word over and over again, if you see a word over and over again, chances are that's a culturally connected term that we're going to want to identify and incorporate into our standardization. So interviewing really helps. Asking people, I want to know more about that word. How long have you been using it? Where did you learn it? Where does it come from? Chances are you'll get really good stories and a really good background about how that language has evolved in that person's lexicon. And then co-authoring. So oftentimes we get people approving and they say they don't like the language or they don't want you to change the language. But understanding that bringing people into the fold as co-authors can really help. Having them draft content or give feedback on drafted content before it goes to approval can help them feel ownership over that. But also having a style guide that, again, lists culturally significant language and accepted definitions and uses will really help alleviate any concern. So if you identify that culturally connected language, you standardize it, especially in a style guide, and then you use it in that accepted way, it can really be helpful to send people back to that style guide and say, well, here's what we've decided as a group. Do we need to change this? If so, we have to have a discussion about changing the style guide. So it no longer becomes a you versus them. It no longer becomes a challenge of their culture. It becomes, we've identified the style guide, we've included culturally specific language that's significant to the culture, and whether or not we need to change the style guide is a different conversation. So we're showing an effort to understand and appreciate the language of the culture, not remove it so much, but standardize it. So that is my presentation. Thank you so much for attending, and I am super excited to hear any questions you might have.
Now it's time to type in those questions if you haven't already. And while you do, here's a look at what's coming up. The TC Dojo Mastermind Groups are monthly driven member discussion groups where attendees present their specific challenges to a group of their peers in a confidential, supportive environment. They can get feedback and advice about topics on their mind in real time from others who've been in their shoes. It's been amazing to participate in and a lot of fun too. You can sign up at the TC Dojo website at mastermind.tcdojo.org. We know sometimes magic is just having the time to collaborate with someone who's been where you are.
I was struck by how much of what you're saying isn't really military unique, right? You always have these places of culture and organizational structure and people who want to do it their way as opposed to some other group's way, or you don't know that it was what you said. They don't know it exists, or they know it exists, but they don't like it and they want to do it in their own way. That is absolutely common in industry as well.
Absolutely. I think something I was struck by as I started to peel back the layers on this issue was just how common it is. And you're totally correct that when we start to peel back and say, okay, let's say start at step one. Is this a military problem? And ultimately, again, as I peel back the layers, it's not really a military specific problem. It might be in a military environment, but we do see this in a lot of different communities. And it is really, it's different in the sense that we have to understand the military culture, and that can be complicated, especially if someone has never served. But beyond that, a lot of the best practices and a lot of the techniques that we use are really generic. They work across the board.
Yeah, I mean, figuring out what's major versus what's minor, what's cultural, what's not, that's human unique. Like that's for all of us, right? All of the
absolutely
the early stuff when they were doing structured authoring, they're like, oh, you've got to get rid of the silos and this, that. I think the military is a great place to look at this problem because you have those structures and it's more obvious.
It is. And another thing with the military is you can't get rid of the silos. So I think one of the things, once we kind of accept, okay, I'm not removing the silos in this organization, how do I work across them? And how do I figure out how to fix these problems by working across them? It becomes a little different.
Well, the silo, I don't think the silos ever go away, but that figuring out, talking to people, really just straight up talking and interviewing, being in the moment and having them, drawing attention to that thing that they do almost subconsciously to bring it out. I think that was really interesting the way you were talking about that. Like, let's talk about this right now.
Absolutely.
What's that?
And I think we can be surprised by how often just not only asking people about their experiences, but showing a genuine interest. And it's not coming at it from a perspective, not as I'm questioning what you're saying and how you're saying it and whether it's right, but saying, I want to know where this came from. So I want to understand your perspective can really help people. They not only open up and you get to learn some about your coworker and about communications in the environment you're in, but they tend to not be defensive. It almost changes their approach. And it's, I'm not questioning. I don't have to defend myself. We're just having a conversation. And that can really change the dynamic as well.
That's amazing. That's good advice, just generally. I love it. Great presentation. Any questions from anybody else? Otherwise, I'll just keep going. But that was great, Melissa. I appreciate your coming and sharing this with us. And I love the microcosm or macro, whatever, the cultural community you've chosen and all of the subcommittees, because I've seen that too. You work for one group and they want it their way. They want the standard, but slightly shifted to their way in the places where the standard was not, let's say, complete or specific.
Absolutely.
Right? There's always spaces for that.
Absolutely. And it is, there's a lot of moving parts. And I say that the guidance becomes general because it is very specific to your situation. So if you're, you work on a contract in a group, it's how do I navigate the issues that are right in front of me, not necessarily, how do I change the world and change this for the whole Navy? So we always want to make sure that, start small, but also understand that big picture.
So, because it'll change over time, or because the ideas will percolate. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Very, very neat.
Thanks for coming to the TC Dojo by Single Sourcing Solutions, where it's all about you. Subscribe to our mailing list at join.tcdojo.org. You'll get a link to this session, as well as announcements for future sessions, and a convenient link to the survey. Every month, we look at the survey results so we can go out and find experts willing to share their expertise. Why should we tell you what to learn? You should tell us. Vote now at survey.tcdojo.org. As always, the TC Dojo is our pleasure to host. If you need more personal help and want to speak to one of our TC Dojo Masters in Residence, just go to ask.tcdojo.org, where you can get your question answered and be on your way. Thanks again, and see you next time.